agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm afraid I'm sinking like a lead-weighted walleye.
Well, hopefully you could stay afloat.
That story went viral worldwide.
You always
sort of at the epicenter of it. So
well, you are tied into these sort of weird viral things in a way that I'm not, which I wouldn't have expected necessarily, because in some ways I feel like you're just such an out of touch elite. But that's a whole other story. So anyway, so we do have a lot we want to get to today. All sorts of stuff about nuclear Armageddon. That's always a good lead, right?
You should lead off with that.
I think generally speaking, yeah. But there's all kinds of other stuff we want to get to as well. Restrictions on chips to China. Biden just letting all the dope smoking hippies out of jail. More updates on the Trump search. A bunch of other stuff, and we are going to get to that in just 1 second. Okay, before we do get to that stuff, Jay, there are a couple quick update items I wanted to touch on. The first is Trey's use of the Ukraine, that term. Trey, a number of listeners have pointed out that Trey uses that term, the Ukraine, as opposed to Ukraine. And I should point out that, prior to 1991, that usage actually would have been correct. And while 1991 was, I understand, a long time ago, Trey is just old enough and I think was politically aware at a young enough age that I think that initial usage just somehow stuck in his head. And because prior to this, it wasn't a country that, American politics folks like Trey and I talked about that much. I think he hasn't just had quite enough practice at switching over to the post-Soviet terminology. When thinking about that, Jay, I was thinking I called Russia the Soviet Union for actually quite a few years after there was no more Soviet Union, at least every once in a while. I don't know if that happened.
Oh, and I think I've done the same.
Yeah.
Even on the show, I think sometimes where I've instead of saying Russian, I've said Soviet.
Yeah. We grew up
and
that
I've had to catch myself on the Ukraine before again, just because growing up, that's what it always was.
Yep.
So it's not that Trey is a Putin lackey. That we know of.
Yeah, I mentioned it to Trey, and he said if I were any more anti-Russia, I'd be Tom Clancy. So but. Yeah, I
really like that.
Yeah,
wow.
I thought it was good. So anyway, the point I wanted to let folks know that no, Trey is not trying to make some sort of a sly political pro-Putin kind of statement, and he is aware of the issue, and I'm sure he is. He will take measures to call Ukraine in the future. But anyway, so that's one update. A second quick update on that New York State lawsuit against Donald Trump and his kids. When Jay and I discussed that, we both wondered about the extent to which this was a victimless crime, in that Trump's lenders haven't brought suit, and in his valuations, Trump's people didn't claim that there was any sort of a fully independent review of those asset values. So the lenders, in effect, hey, they just should have known better. They should have asked. So in our Facebook group, listener Dave asked the following question in response to that discussion. In the segment about the civil case in New York, both Mike and Jay were critical of the case, and one of the things said is that no one is claiming to be harmed. But isn't the other side of the case that those same valuations were falsely deflated to avoid paying taxes? Aren't we, the American taxpayers, the wronged party? And so I thought about that and read through the lawsuit more carefully, and I think the answer, and I think the answer to that is, well, maybe sort of, because there are multiple allegations that in the lawsuit that the Trump organization did fraudulently appraise assets in order to lower their tax liability by millions of dollars, according to the lawsuit. And so there are distinctions between whether you're deflating or inflating, and depending on how tax law works out, that can be to your advantage or disadvantage to have a higher or lower value. So my take on that is, yeah, you can make a case that it's not just the banks that are potentially victims here, if you will. So, Jay, any thoughts on that?
So, well, yeah, and because I looked at it from a strictly real estate tax lens, and the way they work real estate taxes in New York, as in a lot of places, is the political entity, whether it's the county, whether it's the city, the borough. I believe in New York, it's just all of New York has its own tax valuation. They base the real estate tax valuation on the market value, which is based on sales of similar properties, similar nearby properties, all that kind of stuff. That's the calculation to do, and they make that decision, and they say, here's your appraised value. At that point, you can always contest it, saying, no, you're wrong. Here, we have something different. But that the taxing authority, that local taxing authority, would never be in a position where it would necessarily be relying on the organization's internal financials to come up with a valuation for real estate. So to that extent, would deflating values lower your real estate taxes? No. You pointed out, though, that to the extent that there are other programs that Trump might qualify for example, tax credits or something like that, through a state or federal program, which would require him to submit information and say, here's my value, and there's a cutoff threshold. If he were to apply for those programs and get relief that he shouldn't, then yes, that would be defrauding at that point of essentially the federal or state government, whoever that taxing authority is. So that is the yeah. So I think my response is, yeah, kind of, it's sort of like yours, kind of, sort of. But it seems that the bulk of the complaint was aimed at the idea of you are inflating your valuations and telling these banks who are loaning you money that they're fully secured. And if you're dealing with Donald J. Trump, you want to be fully secured, when they may not have been. So.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So there is definitely a lot there in the lawsuit. And so, they allegation after allegation after allegation. But anyway, so we hope that, we always want to try to get those updates and clarifications out there at the top of the show and not buried somewhere in the back. And so anyway, with that out of the way, we can get to nuclear Armageddon.
Yeah.
Jay, you suggested that, if it happens and we don't mention it, we're never going to hear the end of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now, of course,
that was my concern, is that we would, next week people would be climbing out of the radioactive rubble and taking to Facebook of, Jay didn't even mention this,
and so we don't want that. And what we're referring to here is President Biden's remark delivered at a Thursday meeting of Democratic fundraisers that, well, first, Putin is not joking when he talks about potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons, because his military is, you might say, significantly underperforming. And that, here's the big line, we have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, on Friday, the White House issued a statement that we have not seen any reason to adjust our own strategic nuclear posture, nor do we have indications that Russia is preparing to imminently use nuclear weapons. Now, honestly, I didn't really think much of this thing either way. I know there was a big blow up on Twitter and conservative circles and so forth, but because it seemed to me to be, well, it's an accurate statement, I think, though I would say in usual Biden fashion, it was maybe not as well thought out, and there's not enough of a filter, perhaps, in some ways between Joe Biden's brain and his mouth, but and certainly not a helpful thing to say in any non-private setting. But Jay, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I mean, I largely agree with you, right? That this is not a change in policy or something like that. And I do think the problem is, it sort of, as you point out, I think Biden just says stuff, right? and as did Trump as well. But yeah, speaking with people who he's trying to raise funds from, just there was a wonderful back in the day, the Obama administration Saturday Night Live skit where Obama is talking to Biden, and he takes issue with something that Biden had said about him during the primaries, and it was something else like undercutting Obama, and Obama, and I forget who plays who, says like, Joe, did you actually say that? And the Biden in character replies, who the hell knows? To me, that sort of strikes me as that's kind of the sense of this was a one-off. But that said, when you're really talking about, hey, you've got another nuclear armed superpower who is out there saying, hey, we might use nukes, albeit small load tactical nukes. That would behoove, if you're the party of nuance, to not just wander into saying things like that. And to me, the bigger issue is not that, Putin is going to launch a nuclear Armageddon, but the idea of we've never been this close to nuclear Armageddon implies a disproportionate U.S. response.
Yeah, and I think it also. Yeah, go ahead.
If I'm a paranoid Russian and I hear this, that we're at the verge of nuclear Armageddon, what that says to me is, wait a second, are you saying the U.S. is going to it's a nuclear retaliation, and that would be a big policy statement.
Though to be clear,
to me, it's one of those dumb unforced errors.
Yeah. To be clear, Biden didn't say we're at the verge of nuclear Armageddon. He said we haven't faced the prospect of Armageddon since. And so I think again,
which I'd quibble with that as far as historical.
Well, there's some stuff in the 80s, and you could point to a couple other things. But the point being is that it's even if it is a true statement, it's a misleading statement in the sense that we're still, I would argue, a good ways off from any sort of imminent nuclear Armageddon, but that statement makes it sound like we're right at the precipice. And so again, Biden being Biden, I think, but yeah. So.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree, but
so true, but not helpful. I think
doing that. Yeah.
Generally, if you're president of the United States, you might want to just kind of file away the idea that don't be talking about Armageddon in any sense unless you're really.
So there was, Mike, you will remember and appreciate this. There was a time back in the early 80s where Reagan was doing some sort of press thing, and they were testing the mic, right? And as the test thing, Reagan joked, I've just signed legislation outlawing the Soviet Union. The bombing will commence in 10 minutes.
Yeah, not a good.
And again, people jumped in, sort of, not funny. But it sort of strikes me as a little similar to that type of thing.
Yeah, I think so. But and I think these moments often happen with world leaders, with people in the public eye, with everything's being recorded, certainly. And I just think it behooves a president, especially, to be particularly circumspect about that kind of thing. And when you have issues like our last two presidents have had, that can be more of a problem than with maybe some other more naturally cautious folks. But anyway. So we have mentioned nuclear Armageddon now, so we're covered.
One last thing I have to throw out.
Go ahead.
It's kind of a weird pitch to funders, isn't it?
Well, I don't even think it was part of a pitch. Yeah. Yes. Well, we're all gonna be dead. So why don't you just give us a donate?
Maybe it isn't. Look, the world's gonna end soon. So hey,
what's another $1,000? Yeah, exactly. So,
and take it with you.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, interesting fundraising strategy. All right. Well, let's move on. Our first major topic of discussion today, the Biden administration's announcement of sweeping restrictions on the sale of U.S. semiconductor technology to China. The restrictions, which were released by the Commerce Department on Friday, are designed to slow China's development of advanced technology that's directed toward both the advancement of their military and also internal surveillance capabilities. The measures include a ban on U.S. companies supplying advanced chips and chip-making equipment without a special license, which licenses will only be granted under unusual circumstances. And the new rules also ban any companies around the world that use U.S. technology, software, or machinery in their artificial intelligence and supercomputing chips from selling to China, as well as banning U.S. citizens from helping the Chinese develop advanced chip technology. Now, these restrictions are reminiscent of the restrictions imposed on Chinese company Huawei in the Trump administration, though these Biden administration restrictions cover the entire industry in China and not just a single country. And this move has been expected for months, and it's part of a larger U.S. effort to sort of reestablish our former supremacy in computer chip technology. Folks will recall earlier this year, Congress passed bipartisan legislation approving somewhere just over $50 billion in various subsidies for expanding the domestic semiconductor industry here in the U.S. So, Jay, what are your thoughts on this action?
I'm actually going to say that this was a good move by the Biden administration. I'm, as you know, I'm all for free trade. That said, there are certain items that we need to be careful about giving away in order to protect, one, intellectual property of United States companies, and second, not to provide items that can be used either improperly internally or offensively, and I think that's a good move.
Yeah, me too. I mean, like you,
it's not something that's brand new, right? There's been these kind of restrictions on certain types of technology transfer for years. It's just the expansion of it.
Yeah, like you, my default position is usually pro free trade, but I make an exception for countries that don't adhere to, I guess you could call international norms for kind of fair trade practices. And that includes, you mentioned, respect for intellectual property. And China's got huge issues with that. But I would also say countries that sort of game the system to open up or to demand that other markets be open to their goods, but do certain things that essentially close off their own markets, what kind of skirting those rules. And China definitely does a lot of that. And then there's that also, items that are related to defense and national security. And I would add one other thing is that I'm more likely to be okay with trade restrictions when the U.S. is dealing with a non-democratic country, a country that doesn't respect the rights of its workers and its citizens. So I think there are a lot of reasons here to make a big exception to my usual pro-free trade kind of stance here. And like you, I think this is a very smart move.
Yeah. Remember when we banned the export of Teddy Ruxpin?
I do not remember the great.
You don't remember that?
No, I
this would have been, I want to say late 90s, maybe early 2000s.
Oh,
I'm in a nostalgic mood today.
Yeah.
Teddy Ruxpin was this like talking teddy bear, right?
I remember that.
It had some kind of sort of computer chips in it, right? And it would like respond to stuff. You'd be like, "Hey, Teddy, how you doing?" And he'd talk back to you. But no, it found itself on the restricted list of exports because of these chips. That the fear was that they could somehow, get into the wrong hands who could turn them into missile guidance systems or something like that. But no, that was a real thing. We were banning exports of Teddy Ruxpin to certain countries because of that. Look it up, people. I'm not making this up.
I maybe should have the image for this episode to be I pull up an old Teddy Ruxpin or something like people like, what the hell's that? Anyway, all right. Well, we start off with a whole lot of agreement then on something, which is always nice. Now, I think as we shift into our next story, there might be a little less agreement, and that is President Biden's actions this week on marijuana. Biden pardoned everyone who's been convicted of simple possession of marijuana, that's federal charges. And this mass pardon pertains, again, to anyone convicted under federal law or in the District of Columbia. The total number of people here, certainly in excess of 6,500. We don't have an actual number released at this point. Now, there are currently no people serving time in federal prison solely for marijuana possession. And so what this pardon will do is it will help people who were previously convicted, make it easier for them to get a job, find housing, qualify for various benefits, that kind of thing. Though one group that the pardon doesn't apply to, any non-citizens or anyone not lawfully present in the country at the time of their offense. So this is just, lawful U.S. citizens only. And in a video that was released announcing this action, Biden said, "No one should be in jail just for using or possessing marijuana. It's legal in many states, and criminal records for marijuana possession have led to needless barriers to employment, housing, and educational opportunities." And that's before you address the racial disparities around who suffers the consequences. While white and black and brown people use marijuana at similar rates, black and brown people are arrested, prosecuted, and convicted at disproportionate rates. Too many lives have been upended because of our failed approach to marijuana. It's time that we right these wrongs. President Biden also announced that the administration would review how marijuana is classified. And in his remarks, Biden said the federal government currently classifies marijuana as a Schedule I substance, the same as heroin and LSD, and more serious than fentanyl. It makes no sense. And the vast majority, I should point out, of convictions for simple possession occur at the state and not at the federal level. And so Biden also called on governors to follow his lead and use their pardon powers in a similar fashion. And some have. Democrat Tom Wolf, governor of Pennsylvania, he announced his own large-scale pardon for minor nonviolent marijuana offenders an hour after Biden's action was announced. And there are a number of other Democratic gubernatorial candidates who've stated that, if elected, they would issue similar pardons. Finally, though, I should point out, Biden didn't go as far as many decriminalization advocates would have liked. And in that White House statement on his actions, he wrote, "Even as federal and state regulation of marijuana changes, important limitations on trafficking, marketing, and underage sales should stay in place." So, Jay, what do you think about this move? And I want to talk about it, I think, both from a policy standpoint and then maybe get into potential political ramifications. But what do you think about it as policy?
So before I dive into that, because this is a little related to marijuana consumption, Teddy Ruxpin actually debuted in 1985. But I think it was the later 90s incarnation that had the issue. I mentioned that just because Teddy Ruxpin is pretty weird and trippy. And I would expect that if one under the influence, like talking to Teddy Ruxpin.
Gotcha.
But no, in terms of policy, I'm okay with it, I guess. My thought is I would tend to agree with you on a couple fronts. One, people have been convicted of minor possession offenses that ought not to hold up them getting on with their lives. In most cases, these are minor offenses. It's typically misdemeanor possession. When you get into felony possession, things of the magnitude there, I start to wonder a little bit, right? And I'd have to admit ignorance in terms of looking at what the federal statutes are, how much qualifies you for what level of prosecution. But yeah, look, generally it would seem to be that this is a low scale crime. I have no constitutional issue with Biden. I think clearly has the authority to make the pardon. Is it I'm wondering maybe a little bit, as you mentioned, I don't think there's anyone who is sitting in federal prison on marijuana possession charges
Not
solely.
just that,
Today. So it's not like he's opening the prison gates. It's more like he's allowing a lot of people who may have had a conviction to sort of remove that from their, having to note that for employers. Not that really employers would care, I think, these days. But so I guess I come out with this seems to be from a policy thing. It's not changing a whole lot. It's not moving the needle a lot. I think there is the political bounce that he probably gets from it a little bit. And there is always this weird, and I'll talk about it, and I'll concede the right has sort of a gun fetish, and the left has sort of a pot fetish, and it's just this seems to be sort of a manifestation of that.
Then libertarians are all for guns and pot. So
Exactly. There you go. It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah. Well, I guess I feel that I should point out that there are some folks on the right who are arguing that while this may not be unconstitutional, it's in a way kind of an abuse of the power, in that the framers didn't intend the pardon power be used to basically kind of go around saying, well, sure, there's a law against us, but I'm going to pardon everyone who's broken that law, which in effect invalidates that law, and it kind of usurps congressional authority to make laws. And I think that's not an unreasonable argument, but strictly going by the letter of the Constitution, there's nothing that prevents him from doing that. So you can say, yeah, he's kind of going against the spirit of it, maybe, just like you could say that, for instance, President Carter went against the spirit of it when he pardoned everyone who evaded the draft in Vietnam. And in fact, this Biden mass pardon is the largest. That was
exactly the example I was going to use.
There you go. So this is the largest mass pardon since that point. Yes.
Although you could make draw a distinction and that's what you pay me for.
Yeah.
Between the pardoning draft dodgers versus pot users. On the one, you can say that some of these draft dodgers did so out of a moral compunction, right? That they believed Vietnam was an unjust war and they were not going to participate in it. And you could say, well, this is sort of a limited circumstance situation where because of that, we are going to pardon those people. Whereas I think you don't have that same sort of moral principle argument that you had a bunch of weed on you.
No, I can see that, though. I guess I would take issue with that to a certain extent. This gets us to another conversation, maybe, but that I feel like if you have a moral objection to something that your country is doing, sort of running away is not really the way to sort of stand up for that. And so I would agree, but but anyway, but I guess we do agree largely on this. Now the politics, I think one of the reasons why a bunch of Democrats haven't kind of jumped on this bandwagon, especially those running for re-election, maybe, is that the Democrats are already taking a lot of heat for the connection that Republicans are pushing successfully, I think, about being soft on crime. And while I think there's an important distinction to be made between nonviolent minor drug offenders and the sort of crime we think about when we think about, crime, which we tend to think about violent crime, property crime, that sort of thing. I think a lot of Democrats are probably hesitant to jump in because they don't want to make it easier for those attacks to potentially stick with some voters.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. I think what the politics of this does is sort of puts a big neon sign saying, "Hi, we're the party of decriminalization." Yeah,
I think you're right about that.
And not only our party might not enforce laws, might not push for vigorous police force presences and police tactics. We're going to, after the fact, pardon people who were actually convicted. So yeah, I think it plays into that soft on crime narrative very much so. And I'm going to say, so this is bigger. Maybe does it push midterm turnout a little bit? Nah, it's one of those. It's one of those at the margins, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Very marginal.
And I suppose, look, when you're in a campaign, as I've said, it's sort of a game of inches sometimes. And you're like, well, look, if I can squeak out an extra 0.5%, whatever, or if, a couple more potheads who might have forgotten to vote, show up and help our candidate, all the better. But yeah, I don't think it really moves the needle in any meaningful sense. What it does do from more of a cultural standpoint, I think, though, and this is something that bugs me a little. Maybe this isn't even cultural, but And well, we can move into the declassification part, because this sort of goes to that. And I'm not entirely positive that marijuana is as benign as a lot of Democrats would paint it. And again, that sort of goes to a little bit of what I think is the fetishization of pot on the left,
or a lot of libertarians. I just want to point that out.
Libertarians,
they're the ones who are maybe leading. But no, I agree with you, because the more I've thought about this issue, the more skeptical or cautious I've become about marijuana legalization, and which is why I'm actually very much for the reclassification, because that's going to make it easier to do good research to let us have a better sense of this kind of thing, because that's been one of the problems. Classifying as a Schedule 1 has really made it difficult for researchers to do the kind of stuff that we would need to get that sort of information, and it's all just sort of a Wild West kind of thing, and I think that's really problematic. I mean, according to, for instance, the CDC a couple of years ago, research has suggested that around 30% of marijuana users meet the clinical criteria for addiction, which means that they're not able to stop using despite negative consequences for their health or other life kind of stuff. And, and so I think that's significant, right? Especially when you take a look at marijuana use, not surprisingly, way up, just over 28 million people in 2009 compared to almost 50 million people in 2020. And those numbers are again going to be kind of, off, right? Because that's sort of a difficult thing to get a real clear handle on. But my point is if we're creating a larger class of addicts, that I think that's a considerable public health concern, right? And it's not also that legalization is this great panacea, because if you take a look, for instance, California, recreational pot's been legal since 2016, but they estimate that the illegal pot market there is double the size.
And de facto illegal for like probably another 10 years before that.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is when you legalize, then there are taxes that go along, and then people say, well, why don't we just sell this illegally? And in fact, California has recently lowered its pot taxes, trying to find that, I guess, sweet spot, if you will. But my larger point being is that I think the most important part of this is the declassification, because I agree with you, I guess, that maybe states have moved a little bit too quickly with not nearly enough good evidence to just say, oh, sure, that's fine. And I'm a little less sure about that than I was maybe a few years ago.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. No, and something that I don't have the sources to cite to this in front of me, but in studies done of places where marijuana has been legalized, I think what they have seen by and large, it's not that you all of a sudden have more people smoking pot, but you have a certain number of people smoking a lot more pot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's sort of, there are, and whether you're an addict or an enthusiast, that seems to be it's not a matter of, and I think you could compare this. Like, look, we have alcohol sales nationwide, but alcoholism is a problem, and like there are people who can go and have a beer to unwind after work on Friday. There are other people who cannot, right? Who it's if they're going to have one beer, they don't have a beer. It's either nothing or 5 or 6 or whatever your drink of choice is.
You're talking about me here, Jay. I mean, not directly, but yeah, I'm
not talking about you.
I'm exactly one of those people. I'm like a nothing, or I'm good at abstinence.
Oh, okay, yes.
I'm good at wretched excess, but I'm not really good at moderation. And so, I mean, there are plenty of people like that, out there certainly.
And my point, there'd be many people who might say, hey, I'm going to have a joint and unwind and something like that, and then can get on with their lives just fine. There are others for whom it doesn't. And the other piece that I think is troubling is there is a significant correlation. And again, I'm not going to dive into all the stuff between marijuana and significant mental illness like schizophrenia. Now, whether it's causal or not, or whether it's just if you have these mental illnesses, you're more attracted to marijuana. I think that's an issue. If you look at some of these mass shootings, a commonality in a lot of them, and I'm not going to say all of them, is significant marijuana use. And also, if you look at the sort of one of the societal problems we have with young men in our society who are tuning out, dropping out, and I mean that's again, it's a common, it's a common factor in that.
Well, yeah, and again, you're not making a causal argument. You're just saying it seems like these two things often are linked in some way. Yeah, and on the other side of things, I understand the argument that prohibition of something that everyone is doing is arguably even worse, right? Because then it breeds a lack of respect for the law and legitimacy issues and that. And so I think there's a balance to be found there, but I think that sort of, you don't necessarily want to get into the political system boosting these kind of things. Hey, take something that will make you less aware and kind of be able to tune out. In fact, I would argue that's less of what we need. And you can get into whole kind of neo-Marxist perspectives on how the ruling elites and the owners of capital would love us to be just kind of dazed and confused. And
I know, I'd say quite the contrary. 'Cause to me, it's a so often of employers I hear from is that they can't find people to work. One, because they can't pass a drug test. Now, again, maybe you don't need to pass a drug test to, whatever, work at a fast food place, or maybe you do. But certainly if you're in an industrial setting or you're driving a forklift or something like that, it's important. And I think that's, we have this sort of, issue right now where we have people who are not filling jobs, and the message I think ought to be get off your ass and get to work. That's gonna be my campaign slogan, Mike.
With that. Well, actually,
and the wider distribution of marijuana would seem to be counter to that message.
All right, Jay. So we have, this week, I should point out, Donald Trump filed an emergency appeal before the Supreme Court. And in his appeal, his attorneys argued that the 11th Circuit Court of Appeal should not have ordered that those 100 seized documents marked as classified, that they shouldn't have been excluded from review by Special Master Raymond Dearie. The argument has generally in the media been explained as being highly technical, which is basically media speak for this is really complicated and we think you'll get confused.
You don't get it.
Yeah. So, but it's important to note, we will get into that. It's important to note, though, that Trump is not asking the court to block the Justice Department from using the classified documents until they're reviewed by the special master. So this is a very limited sort of appeal, if you will. And the appeal went to Justice Thomas, not because of any sort of conspiracy theory thing, just because...
Because of Ginny.
No, not because of Jenny, right? But because he's just the person who's in charge of receiving appeals from the that circuit.
Yes.
It's the circuit he oversees.
Yes.
So
and then actually, I'll throw this out because it's an interesting factoid. Every circuit has its own sort of presiding justice, who sort of keeps tabs on them, if you will. And it's just I think that's kind of fascinating and geeky that you have a Supreme Court justice who kind of looks over you.
Like the RA for the circuit, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a good example. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And Justice Thomas is the RA for the 11th Circuit. Yeah. So.
And so I think, Jay, where we need to start off here is with some of those technical terms, because I think our listeners won't be confused and are actually interested in this. So can you maybe start us off by explaining a couple of terms that I think are very important to this interlocutory decision, and also what it is and how it is that they're not necessarily appealable, at least not right away?
Yes. So the deal is with appeals, what the appeals court wants, what we want as a society, is for the purposes of judicial efficiency, right? Is if you're going to have an appeal, you ought to appeal everything all at once. So the standard default rule is the court will issue at the end of the case, right? The court may have a whole bunch of rulings throughout the case, some involving discovery, some involving what testimony comes in, some involving issues of law, some involving evidence, and all of this, comes up to then you have a final judgment of the court, and the court then will typically stamp it, literally stamped. It says final appealable order, which means, look, we have decided all the issues in this case. There's nothing left for the trial court to decide. This is over, and at that point, then that whole judgment can be taken up to the Court of Appeals, whether it's federal, state, whatever. The principle works the same both places. And again, that's the idea, because otherwise you would have people who are appealing stuff throughout the case, and it would, cases would drag on far, far longer than they even do right now. So interlocutory orders are orders that interlocutory comes from the Latin sort of like while we are talking, which are those orders which are while you're talking with the court, while the case is going on. They don't finally settle the case. It might be, listen, I'm going to rule that this piece of evidence can come in or not come in. And then what happens is you go to trial, and at the end of the day, then if you lost, then you can appeal, well, that piece of evidence should have come in. So that's interlocutory orders are typically not appealable for the reasons I just went into, that judicial efficiency and getting everything teed up to the Court of Appeals at once. There are exceptions, though.
And this is when you're going to get into the collateral order doctrine, right? That's
exactly right.
Okay.
Right? These exceptions under what's called the collateral order doctrine get to when you can have an interlocutory order that can, in effect, decide the case, right? And I should say the opposite of interlocutory is what's called dispositive order, which is essentially summary judgment for ex plaintiff, something like that. So if you've got an order that's interlocutory, but could essentially decide the case or render the case moot, or would impede upon some other substantial legal right, like in this case, a privilege, then you can appeal those immediately. And the idea is, I sort of mentioned this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about this, about these claims of privilege is, once you lose privilege, it's gone, right? It's the bell that can't be unrung. Right. So therefore, privilege questions typically do fall into that collateral order exception. And I think that's essentially what's being argued here is it should be appealable because if the privilege is gone, at that point it's gone, and Trump is forever prejudiced by that. So
and I think
that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it seems to me that part of the reason, maybe understanding why Trump's appeal seems so limited, because it's not focusing, it's not asking the Supreme Court to tell the Department of Justice to once again stop using the documents.
Right.
It seems to me that part of it, the order, is an injunction that Judge Cannon said, stop using these documents, and injunctions are actually immediately appealable, as opposed to
typically.
Okay,
yeah.
So, and I think that maybe helps to explain why Trump didn't ask for more, because his attorney said, listen, we're not going to win on this, but we could potentially win on arguing that the 11th Circuit didn't have jurisdiction on this more generally, and so. In my understanding of this, in reading over the brief or the documents filed by Trump's attorneys, it seems to me that actually they maybe have kind of a case here, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
There you go again, defending Donald Trump.
It's
no, I this is what I've been saying for a couple of weeks, and I've taken all kinds of heat for it. And it's not so much a case of they have a point necessarily on the merits, like they're going to win. But the point is this an issue that ought to be looked at before the case moves further? And thus it should be immediately appealable. And again, I think, yes, I think Trump's claims for executive privilege are pretty thin. But that said, their claims for executive privilege, and this is the first time you've had a sitting president's Justice Department investigating a former president, the immediately preceding former president, and potential, presidential candidate. And in that case, I think it's wise to say, look, let's take our time. And what he's essentially asking would be that the Justice Department can't use this until the special master has looked at it and screened for privilege. Which again strikes me as, under the circumstances, not unreasonable.
Right. Well, although, just to be clear, in that appeal, he's actually not asking the Justice Department, or not asking the Supreme Court to tell the Justice Department to stop using the documents until they're reviewed by the special master, just saying that these documents do have to be reviewed by the special master. And so, I mean, that's that's one of those weird distinctions, I think, that's based on what is potentially immediately appealable and what isn't immediately appealable. But all this stuff at the end would be subject or grounds for appeal. And some folks would argue that, well, that's exactly what Trump and his attorneys are doing, is they're just trying to drag this out as long as possible. But in the end, it seems to me that...
and to some extent, I think they're right. Yeah. I mean, that's what, you may be shocked to find this, but that's what a lot of defendants do.
There you go. Yeah. And certainly, though, I think in the end, it's not going to matter a whole heck of a lot. And this maybe gets to a related story here. On Wednesday, the 11th Circuit, the same 11th Circuit, they granted the Justice Department's request for an expedited appeal. In the request, the government said, well, our inability to access those non-classified documents that we seized, they're actually holding back our investigation in significant ways. And so the appeals court said, okay, they set a deadline of October 14th for the government to submit their brief, November 10th for Trump's folks to respond, and then November 17th for any kind of reply brief from the government. And so that's, and so I wondered what you thought about that ruling. Any thoughts on, the consequence, the significance of that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, at this point, we don't really have a ruling, right? We have a briefing schedule.
Right. Okay. And so, but I mean, they could have.
So, but I think, look, I think that's the right procedure, right? Say, look, this is important. You say it's something, it's time sensitive. So let's do an expedited briefing schedule and let's get a decision on that in the merit. So I think that's, to me, that seems to be exactly what I would expect the court to do, and that seems to be proceeding expeditiously, but still with due respect for all the rights of all the parties involved.
So, do you think that in the end, this just goes back to what former Trump Attorney General Bill Barr said, and this is just sort of a brief, or even maybe a not so brief rain delay, but it's not really going to affect anything that ultimately happens?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
No, and I've said that. From day one. I get here. Let me expand on the rain delay metaphor. And this is my reason, and I shouldn't even talk about this. Say there is you're playing the game, and storms start to come in. It starts raining. Oh my God! Actually, I have an even better one. I won't get well. And look, it's raining, and you're thinking, well, look, we can still push through this. We'll still push through this. The one team says, we really got to get through this. Come on, we're winning. And then what you have happen is it's slippery, and the pitcher slips off the mound, twists his ankle, is hurt seriously, out for the rest of the playoffs. Right at that point, you would say, wow, we really should have taken a rain delay there. And we could have gone back and played the game. Everything would have been fine. It probably would have turned out the same way. The counter argument, one that strikes me very personally, is the 1990 or the 2016 World Series, wherein the Cleveland Indians were on their way to cruising to a World Series win. They had the momentum, and then rain came in, and they pulled out the tarps, and everybody had to wait a couple hours, and then the Cubs came back and won. That's sort of the government's fear, and it hurts me to say that I'm as an Indians fan, and I'm on the same side as the government here. But that's the issue, right? Is that if the government feels, hey, we got the momentum, we don't want a rain delay. So no, I think that's sort of an apt metaphor, and I think in most cases, it doesn't change things drastically. And look, even with the special master stuff, that has not gone as well as Trump might have hoped. So,
well, and one difference, though, I would say between the metaphor here in real life is that if in fact Donald Trump is guilty of committing certain crimes and he is using this delay to in some way make it less likely he's convicted, that's different than a team that just says, well, let's just it's not about momentum and winning or losing. It's about, if someone is actually breaking the law here. And that's a whole different kind of element.
Yeah, well,
right?
yes and no. Because here's the thing. If you are, look, a lot of times the goal is, and I see this more in civil cases than you do in criminal, but look, just if you're losing, just keep delaying, and maybe things will break your way, right? Maybe there's something that comes up. Maybe there's some new piece of evidence that you didn't know about. Some other witness comes forward. The prosecutor gets hit by a bus, whatever, right? That if you're, you get to a point of like, look, things are going bad all around.
What I'm saying is that when you're talking about like baseball or whatever kind of sports with delays, it's one thing of saying, well, this is about safety and momentum.
Oh, I understand.
It's another thing. Yeah. Yes. It's another thing if one team says, yes, let's have a rain delay because that will give us more time to get rid of our cork bats.
Right.
And that would be like, well, that's not okay. That's not legitimate.
Right.
So yeah, that's all.
Right.
So
right. No, that would not be.
Okay.
If you're somehow saying that, yes, doing justice is more important, the justice system is more important than the Cleveland Indians winning the World Series.
You would maybe take issue with that. I don't know.
I would take issue with that, but
All right.
So.
Okay, well,
justice is important and all, but
Yeah, you got to have your priorities, I think. So, well, let's kind of stay on the whole kind of justice, I guess, theme, if you will, because of course this past Monday was the first Monday in October, and that's a big deal for court watchers because that's when the Supreme Court begins its term every year. And this term, joining the court for the first time, we have Judge Jackson, who's replacing retired Judge Breyer. And now, that change in personnel isn't likely to mean a whole lot in terms of general outcomes because, of course, Republican-appointed justices still occupy 6 of the 9 seats on the court. Now, there are a number of cases on the docket in which the court could, I think, hand down decisions with pretty wide-ranging implications. There's that challenge to kind of the last vestiges of the Voting Rights Act coming out of Alabama. There's this college admissions affirmative action case. There's the independent state legislature theory going to be put to test, a bunch of things. And we will be talking about those specific cases when they're actually argued and decided by the court. So today, though, what we wanted to focus on is the court sort of as an institution. And I want to start things off, Jay, by just asking you kind of a general question, a very general question. What sort of shape would you say that, I guess, the court specifically and federal courts are in general right now as we, sit here, whatever?
Pretty good.
I mean, not just in terms. I guess what I mean is in terms of public perception and legitimacy and that sort of thing.
I would still say pretty good.
Okay.
I would. I think courts, the justice court system in general, still enjoys a lot more respect and the idea of legitimacy more so than elected branches or elected officials. And I think that's right, and I think that's appropriate. Does that reputation ebb and flow? Yes, I think it does, and it ebbs and flows on a couple things. One is sort of consistency of decisions. I think another, I hesitate to throw it out there, is popularity of decisions. but I think if you have one, you can live through the others, right? You can, for example, you can say Brown versus the board was in many cases an unpopular decision in many quarters. It was screamed out as illegitimate in many quarters. But the consistency of that opinion, the correctness of that opinion, I think changed minds down the road.
I mean, the long-term trend. The long-term trend is still toward less respect and toward the court, and less of a feeling that they're doing the right thing and that sort of thing. So I mean, and in fact, I don't know. I mean, you have.
I know. I would let's say there's a trend, but I would say, compared to when, right?
I mean, over the last, say, 20 years or so. Certainly. I mean, looking at the polling data, and certainly while approval is better than for other branches, right? But it's still kind of at new lows basically over time. I mean, in the early 2000s, it was, approval was in the low 60s, and now we're in the, in the kind of 40s somewhere. And sure, some of that may be, there are some short-term things, obviously, but there are longer-term, I think, factors just in general, Americans having less trust in institutions and government and that sort of thing. But, we also have a situation where, unlike ever before, we have Supreme Court justices talking a lot about the legitimacy of the court. And, Chief Justice Roberts saying, hey, you can disagree with decisions, but that doesn't mean that the court is illegitimate. And even I think it was Justice Kagan who at least obliquely suggested that maybe people have a right to be concerned with what seems like partisan hackery. And I don't have the quote right in front of me, but my point is that the justices themselves are talking about this more than they have certainly in my memory.
Yeah, and that's a little unfortunate.
Maybe
more than a little unfortunate, I think.
Maybe, and here's why I say maybe, because it certainly would be wrong to just say, well, the court decided against me, ergo the court is illegitimate, right? I mean, as wrong as it would be to say, well, we lost this election, therefore the election must be rigged, right? So, okay, that's
exactly.
But there can be cases where someone makes a decision and that decision has been made, in fact, for reasons that are not legitimate, in which case people would be right to raise that question. And so I guess
correct.
So I don't think that Chief Justice Roberts is saying that, well, you can never question the legitimacy of the court. He's just saying that shouldn't be your default, basically, if you lose.
Well, and I think there's also a distinction to be drawn between saying the court got it wrong on a particular decision and saying the court's illegitimate, or saying that the decision is illegitimate because of bad motives or something like that.
And, and I want to get into that because, a lot of listeners know that on last week's episode, Ken repeatedly characterized federal district court judge Eileen Cannon as being corrupt. And, if you've been listening for a while, you also probably know that Ken has not shied away from calling many of the conservatives on the Supreme Court corrupt as well. And, Ken isn't with us today, but I wanted to talk about this. And so I contacted him and said, listen, what do you mean by this? And I had a sense. And so I think it's important to get this out there. And so he had a lot to say on it. And I just kind of want to pull out some snippets that I think maybe might help people understand what he means by this. And then, Jay, you and I can kind of talk about this a little bit. But what Ken said in response to this, when I said, well, what do you mean by corrupt? He said, I imagine that they all think that they're following the law as they see it, and the space for their corruption is created by the sad fact that there's no accepted universal methodology that dictates law or dictates how to interpret or discover the law. And so there's a lot of room for judges to cherry pick methods to obtain desired results in particular cases. And Ken continues, in my view, doctrine, that is, adhering to judicial precedent, is the most legitimate and the most principled of the methods of legal interpretation, and it's the one that all judges below a jurisdiction's highest court are almost always supposed to follow. Supreme Court justices are less constrained by precedent in principle, but in practice, if they won't prioritize it in their judicial decision-making, then there's usually nothing to stop them from deciding cases according to their partisan preference through a cherry-picked patchwork of theories reverse engineered to reach a particular result. And he says, I call this mode of judicial decision-making corrupt. I think it's especially stark in particular areas of law, such as cases involving voting rights, campaign finance law, and districting. In those areas of law, I don't think a single sitting Republican justice has ever voted against the political interest of the Republican Party in any major case. But I don't think that they have the self-awareness to understand their own corruption. So that's Ken's kind of more in-depth depiction of what he means by corruption. And actually, on that definition, I don't disagree with him. I think I would not use the term corruption. I would use motivated reasoning. I would use kind of inherent bias that we all have as human beings. I don't think corruption is the correct word, but I think based on what he's saying, I certainly agree with his underlying reasoning, though I would use a different word. And so I wanted to get your take on that, though.
Well, just for the record, I did not say that the Supreme Court lacks the self-awareness to be aware of their own corruption.
Okay,
if anyone from the Ohio Bar Disciplinary Counsel's office is listening, the words and thoughts of Ken Katkin are not my own. No, I look, if one, I have to take issue with Ken because I do think corruption, he can define it as how he means it, but it's got a really real meaning in the judiciary and in legal situations. And that is, it implies something that there is, in fact, criminal. It is a decision-making process that is based on either a personal interest or a political interest that is not made in the interests of justice or the law as they see it. One can become there's a lot of substantial case law out there on issues of what attorneys can say criticizing the court. And this is Mike, this is a little weird, right? Because it's something that struck me as weird when I got to law school. You as an American non-attorney citizen, you can say whatever the hell you want.
And I do.
About any judge, any court, and you do. Right? And you are completely within your First Amendment rights to do so. And if any government agency tried to come after you for that, I would be the first to defend you at a reasonable rate. But for attorneys, it's different. When you're a lawyer, you surrender some of your First Amendment rights in exchange for the privilege of practicing law. That's what the case law says, right? And part of that goes to when you're an attorney, you have a couple duties, right? You always have a duty to your client, but you also have a duty to the system, to upholding the integrity and reputation of the system. Because if that integrity and reputation goes away, to some extent, so does your livelihood. So you can say it's self-interested. You can say it's high-minded. Either way, and one of these tenets is you can't go around calling judges corrupt or implying that they made decisions on political motives or financial motives or anything other than the law, unless you've got some really damn good evidence to show. If you do have some really good damn evidence, then there's a process to do that. And again, Mike, this doesn't apply to non-combatants like yourself, right? You can say whatever you want. But the reason is a lot of times, and I've done this, and just think about this for a minute, right? If you're a litigant in a case and you go into this case saying, I've got this, I know I'm right, because almost every litigant believes in their heart that they are right. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing this. And the judge rules against you. Well, what's your response to that? It must be crooked, right? Because otherwise, how could he come out?
Because I'm right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. How could he not see this? This is plain. And there may be reasons of, well, listen, because X, this is what the law says. This is what the statute says. And maybe it's not fair. Maybe it's not right. Maybe you disagree, but that's what it says. It could also be of, look, maybe you did have this really good evidence that is really compelling to you and maybe should have been compelling to the jury, but the judge said, no, it's not coming in because of whatever evidentiary rule. And so there were a lot of those types, and I've had plenty of those conversations where, I shouldn't say plenty, but I've had those conversations where, people say, oh, you think something's up, you think the judge, and the answer is no. Sometimes the court just doesn't see it your way. There can also be that, right? Even setting aside the law they're constrained to work within, the evidentiary rules. Sometimes you have a judge who just doesn't see it your way, and I can say, look, I disagree, but to ascribe that, and the reason. So I have a point, and I will get to it. The reason that you don't want attorneys just saying this is that attorneys are presumed to have sort of a better knowledge of the law and of when there is real corruption, and so you don't want people just crying wolf, right? If there is corruption, it's a big deal, and it ought to be shouted out, right? That this is really, really bad. If every decision you disagree with is corrupt, again, you get into a boy who cried wolf type situation, and just brings everybody into disrepute. And the second piece is judges aren't free to defend themselves, and that's something that's pretty important. Is when you call a judge corrupt, that judge is ethically prohibited from going out and talking, and even if not ethically prohibited, then just prudentially prohibited from going around and saying, no, I'm not corrupt, or approve it or defend. And that's the other rationale that courts have said. And listen, attorneys have limited rights when they criticize the judiciary. So those are kind of my points. And God knows there's plenty of courts I disagree with, and there's plenty of decisions I disagree with, and it's perfectly fine to disagree with the decision. Courts of appeals, litigants, law review, article writers do it all the time and for a living. But to say something else, to ascribe a motive that is corrupt, and I understand Ken may be using the word differently, but I think that's
So, I mean, do you think?
I don't think you can use the word corrupt differently.
Well, I think
in that context.
Gotcha. I understand what you're saying from kind of a legal attorney perspective, but I think in terms of certainly, and as I've said, I would not use the word corrupt, even though I agree with Ken's underlying argument. In fact, I agree with it, and I think it applies to both conservative and to liberal judges, in that we're human beings, and there's a vast literature on how human beings almost all use, to a certain extent, motivated reasoning to get to certain conclusions that they prefer for whatever reasons. And that's
absolutely,
and that's almost always, or that's often, an unconscious thing. And so plenty of people, and that's what Ken is saying, that, well, I'm sure they think that they're not doing anything wrong, and there's certainly no personal gain or anything like that. But and so in that sense, I think, he's absolutely right. That happens all the time because we're human beings. And there's a good reason why, say, Republican-appointed judges, for instance, almost always side on some of these issues with, I don't know if it's all the time, like Ken says, but almost all the time, because they were picked.
Justice Gorsuch.
Well, they were chosen because of their past views on that sort of thing, especially, I think, more and more as we go into the modern court. I think a lot of conservatives saw Chief Justice Roberts is kind of like a great example of how not to choose a justice for the court, because, like, wow, he turned out to be too squishy. We're not going to make that mistake again. And so therefore, if you pick people who are inherently more ideologues, you're going to get more ideologically consistent decisions without those decisions being corrupt in the terms, the kind of standard legalistic terms, but certainly being motivated by that underlying ideology.
Yeah, I would agree that everyone, when they come to the bench, brings ideology and the way they look at the law with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's to be expected. And I actually think that's a good thing, right? Because if you come in and say, listen, I've got this consistent ideological perspective, this is how I'm going to rule on things, and you stick to it, you build that credibility. And obviously, I think you can make the argument, and some have made. There was a book that I haven't read. I've read the book review, and I'm gonna. But Erwin Shermaninsky, a professor at Stanford, wrote a book sort of criticizing the idea of originalism or textualism. And one of his criticisms is, well, they don't stick to it. But to me, that's not a criticism of the theory. That's a failure of certain judges to adhere to it, right? They don't follow their own rules. Fair enough. Sorry, I just had
no, but I think that's the human condition. I mean, and so that's understandable, and we would hope that judges, that everyone right in the political system would at least be aware of that. And I think one of the problems maybe that's unique to the Supreme Court, or anyone who has kind of lifetime tenure without any sort of a check, even from an appeals court, because they are, they're the final word, is that it's probably very easy to drink too much of your own Kool-Aid and just start to think, well, I'm certainly not biased. And we've talked about this in a way, Jay, before, talking about the recusal issue, right? I would think that lower court judges would be a little more likely to consider these things carefully because they know that those decisions, to recuse or not, can be reviewed. Whereas if you're on the Supreme Court, it's like, well, what? There's no appeal on that. And so I think it can be particularly problematic when we get to a level where there is no more appeal.
Yeah, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again because it's one, it's kind of clever, and two, it's correct. The Supreme Court isn't final because it's right. It's right because it's final. Right.
And that, yeah.
So and that's, that essentially means that, listen, it's not that the Supreme Court is infallible, but they are just the last word. Now, and again, I can disagree with Ken on and his idea about precedent, that to some extent, it is appropriate. And there's, a test spelled out for this, when precedent ought to be abandoned, as it was in Brown, as it was in Dobbs, as it was in, some like the overruling Lochner cases, right? There comes a time when courts need to say, look, we decided this case, but we got it wrong, or our predecessors got it wrong, and I think that's an important judicial function.
And I think so, I'll say on Ken's argument about precedent, I certainly agree with him that being very deferential to precedent certainly makes it more difficult for justices to inject their own human biases into things. But in a sense, though, it just changes the locus of the problem because it's just replacing that. Still, previous courts have injected their biases, right? And so you're just saying, well, let's let their biases stand. Well, that's not really necessarily, to me, a solution. It just sort of, like I said, changes where the bias is coming from, essentially. So there's, in the end, there's just no good reason. And when I talk about, judicial interpretation to the students in class, I say, listen, this is not a mechanistic sort of thing. There's always an inherent subjectivity in this kind of thing. And there's no way to take that out. It would be great if there were, but that's just not how the law works.
Well, I don't even know if it would be great if it were, right? Because look, courts are a human institution.
Yeah. Well, it would be great. It would be great to know if we absolutely knew exactly what every word of the Constitution and the law meant, and it was not open to interpretation. That would make life a lot simpler. But that's just not how language and people work, basically.
Well, and not only that, but there is the who decides that, right? I mean, if we were to create some great AI system right now that could be, synthesize all of written law and come up with the correct answer.
You'd have Chinese chips. We couldn't trust that. Yeah, So.
Exactly. With the chips made and the Chinese have taken from us. No, I think that's courts are a human institution. Look, we're always, we live in an imperfect world, and to say that any system, political system, judicial system is perfect, I think you can't say that, and you always ought to have some sort of mechanism for amendment or fixing problems down the road, or even just realizing that maybe the problem you're looking at now isn't the problem now. And again, it's different at the Supreme Court versus lower courts. In a lot of cases, there are issues where I think quite properly, a case I was involved in maybe a year or two ago with the Sixth Circuit, where the court ruled against what I was hoping for. But I would also say they got it completely right. They said, listen, we think, you got a really good argument here. But there's this Supreme Court case that sort of says the other, and we can't really reconcile them. And this is above our pay grade, and this is something, we're bound to follow precedent. And so in a lot of ways, look, it wasn't the result that I had wanted. But I think it was the exact correct result if you were a judge saying, listen, this is the precedent we're bound to follow. If you disagree, please take it up with the Supreme Court.
And, in the end, I know we're running a little long, but I want to point out, just to kind of wrap this up, is say that nobody on this podcast is saying that federal judges or the Supreme Court, and more specifically, that they're saying, okay, what is the outcome that I want here, and how do I reach that? That no one is, even Ken is not saying that there's this like conscious thing of like, well, how can I get my side to win? Because that would be certainly corruption, and that's the kind of corruption you're talking about, Jay, and that would definitely be illegitimate. And while that has happened in the past, certainly every once in a while, that is not what anyone is saying is happening on the Supreme Court or in general in federal courts right now. So I just wanted to make that clear. All right. Well, with that, before we do go, I want to thank our newest supporter, Jonathan, on Patreon. Thank you so much. It really does help keep things going, and we really do appreciate your support. And also, if you are not already a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one, because, like I said, without you, we couldn't keep on doing this week after week. And supporters get all kinds of good stuff, ad-free versions of everything we put out, our supporter-exclusive midweek show, where Jay and I are going to be in just a minute here talking about all kinds of stuff, like maybe our updated midterm predictions. That things are looking a little less good from my side, I would say, and maybe some ideas of politics as a fight of good against evil, or the forces of light against the forces of darkness. Jay, I'm sorry, you would be the forces of darkness here in this scenario. But anyway, maybe some other stuff as well. Ranked choice voting.
That's what the forces of darkness always say, though, isn't it? It's the other side's of forces of darkness.
That's true. That's true. But anyway, there's a lot of good stuff. And if you are a supporter, you will get that. And by the way, if you would like to hear all that stuff, but you're not in a position financially to support the show, we never want that to be a barrier. So please, if that's you, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up with access to our midweek show. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you can subscribe, rate and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, and share episodes on social media. And as always, we love hearing from you. There's our Discord for supporters that's very active, and you tell us all kinds of stuff. Also, we're on Facebook and Twitter. You'll find links in the show notes. And you can also email us at mail@politicsguys.com. And finally, before we go, a special thanks, as always, to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week. We hope you'll join us.